This project is made possible in large part through the support of my viewers on Patreon and more recently through channel memberships here on YouTube. Without their generous support, I don't think I'd be going ahead with this project. This video is the first in a series that covers the building of a homemade table saw that I've been designing and planning for the past 4 years. And in this one, I'll be building the lift and tilt subassembly, which is the heart of the saw and overall probably the most complex part. I'm making the bulk of this project from Baltic birch plywood, and most of that's going to be 3/4 of an inch thick. And I've made a habit of checking the corners of the plywood that I'm using to make sure that it's actually square. And I can see that this is just slightly out, so I'll have to keep that in mind going forward. To correct that out of squareness, I've got my Norm Abrams style panel cutting sled here. And I'm going to put the fresh cut edge up against the fence and trim off the adjacent side to make it square. This part that I'm working on here is called the main divider, and it's probably the most important part in the entire saw because it holds the front bearing of the arbor. So everything has to be very precisely made, especially the location for that bearing. I've carefully marked that out, and I'm going to bring it over to my drill press and drill out the 1 3/4 inch hole, which is actually a counterbore. And after I have that drilled to the correct depth, I'll finish drilling all the way through with a 1 1/4 inch bit. I've got another machining operation that I have to do on this part, and that's to cut a 1/4 inch deep recess on the top. And this is for a steel mending plate that will be screwed in place above the bearing. And I'm looking at this as kind of like insurance because there's not a whole lot of wood above the bearing, and this plate will stop it from breaking. And then there are several ways that you can cut this recess, but I'm going to do it on my router table with a straight cutting bit. The next parts to make are the slide and the lower support. And I've got a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I can get both of these out of from one strip. The next parts that I need to work on here are the upper incline plane and the lower one. And these are cut on an angle. And to do that accurately, I've laid out the dimensions right on the piece. And then I'm going to temporarily fasten a strip of plywood to use as a guide to cut this angle. However, the piece I have here is not quite wide enough, so I've cut another strip to space it far enough away so that it clears the stock underneath. The lower one is not as wide, but has exactly the same angle as the upper, so I won't have to cut that again. I have some other machining operations to do with the upper incline plane, and the first is to drill a 1 1/4 inch hole, and this is clearance for the shaft of the arbor. And then I need 4 3/4 inch counterbores for the T-nuts that will be pressed into this after. After I drill the counterbore, I drill a 5/16 inch hole all the way through in each location, and that's for the body of the T-nut. Pressing the T-nuts in with a clamp is one way to do it, but a much faster way is to just pound them in with a mallet. I still don't have all of the wooden parts cut out, but I want to shift my focus to the metal parts briefly. These are strips of 1/8 inch thick steel that are 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'm going to be using screws to fasten them to the wooden parts, so I need to drill the holes for those and the countersinks as well. The screw heads can't stick up above the surface. The pieces of steel that I'm adding here are actually bearings. All of the moving parts in this tilt lift mechanism have to move smoothly and precisely, and steel on steel does that. There's very little friction, and there's also very little wear. Now to get back to cutting out the rest of the parts for this assembly. The next is the back cover, and this is made from 1/2-inch plywood, and it needs to have a rectangular cutout at the top, and this is for the mounting plate for the rear bearing that can be moved around to adjust the alignment of the arbor. I've decided that it's a good idea to finish the parts as I'm going along with a single coat of water-based polyurethane. And what that'll do is it'll protect it from moisture now while I'm putting it together, and also in the future when I'm using it. Moving on to the lift carriage end. And once again, these are 3/4-inch plywood. And there are 2 of these, and there's not a whole lot to them other than there's a slot that's cut into it for the slide to slide through, and the top is also angled. Moving on to the tilt and carriage. Once again, this is 3/4-inch plywood. And like the lift carriage, it has an angle cut on the top that I'm cutting on the miter saw here with the top butted up against the fence. And it also has a slot for the slide to fit through, except this one's not as long. I also need to cut a groove or a dado for a piece of the bearing steel to fit into, and this is 1/8 of an inch wide and 1/4 inch deep. And I'm going to make it in 2 passes on the table saw. The last parts to cut out are definitely the most tricky to do, and these are the trunnions for the saw. And once again, I'm using 3/4-inch plywood for this, and these need to be cut in a very precise arc. So what I did was I actually made a circle cutting jig for my trim router here, and I've got my plywood double-sided taped down to a bigger piece to keep it from moving while I make the cut. I very carefully set the outer radius, which is 6 inches, and I've got 2 centers drilled out, 1 for each trunnion. Also, I'm not cutting this all at one time. I've got the router bit set to around 3/16 of an inch for the first cut, and I'll make the 2 arcs for both pieces, and then I'll adjust for a deeper cut and make another pass, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go all the way through, but I'm just going to leave a very thin amount on the other side. And I'll be able to cut that off with the knife and sand it smooth after. After I had the trunnions fully routed, I cut them down the middle on a table saw, and then I brought them over to the bandsaw and I cut through the thin layer that was left. And then to get rid of that thin layer, I once again used my router table, using the same bit that I had in there before, except this bit does have a bearing on the bottom that'll ride up against the side as it cuts away that excess. To trim these to the right size, I need to fasten them to the tilt carriage ends. And to do that, I've made accurate marks, and I'm going to line up the inside arc of the trunnion with those. Then I can drill pilot holes and countersinks for 1 1/4 inch screws to hold these in place. The next operation is to glue in the most important bearing And that's the one that I cut the slot for, and I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy in 3 places to hold that in. And while I'm waiting for that to set, I can cut the thinner strips of sheet metal that make up another part of the bearing. I can then lay down a very thin bead of polyurethane construction adhesive to glue those strips down. And I'm using another one of the 1/8 inch thick bearings clamped down on top of it to hold it in place until that glue sets. And before I set this aside to dry, I'm going to add a bead of polyurethane construction adhesive just to make sure that it never comes loose. Finally, I can get started on assembly, and to begin, I'm going to fasten the lift carriage ends to the upper incline plane, and then when that's done, I can fasten the rear cover. With the rear cover in place, I can position and clamp the lower incline plane and then drive screws in through the rear cover. Next step is a little bit tricky again. I need to locate the slide correctly and fasten it to the lift block. And to do that, I've clamped the lower support where it's supposed to go and using that as a guide to locate the slide. I can then mark the screw locations and then drill and drive the screws. Unfortunately, I got the location wrong to begin with, so I had to move it again to get the full range of lift. And when I fastened it this time, I used some glue in there as well. And now while this is still apart, I can get some lubrication on these bearings. And I'm just using a thin layer of Vaseline and I'm spreading it on with my finger. Next step is to install the main divider, and I've made spacer blocks to position it the correct distance away from the inclined planes, while once again I fasten it with screws. I should say at this point that I'm only using screws to assemble this, since it will need to be taken apart occasionally for maintenance. With the main divider installed, I can get the arbor put in, and I'm using 2 angle blocks plus 2 clamps to press that in. It's a nice snug fit in the hole. I can also get the bearing installed in the rear bearing plate and then get that put onto the arbor, and I'm using a deep socket to seat that. With much of the lift carriage put together and the arbor installed, I can then measure and cut the filler strip for the top. It does have to be notched for the upper T-nuts on the back panel, and I use a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to do that. I can also get the reinforcing plate installed above the arbor. Even though it's strictly not necessary, I'm going to add a bead of glue underneath it before driving in the 2 number 10 screws. Now's a good time to fasten the front panel, and just like the rest of it, I'm not using any glue here, just 1.5 inch screws. And I can get the bolts put in for the rear bearing plate. This plate is separate from the back panel because it allows me to adjust the alignment of the arbor if I need to. What I'm doing here is I'm polishing one edge of the flat bar that will be one of the bearings on the back of the lift carriage. And I only need to do this on one edge, and that's the edge that goes up against the other bearing. Next, I can get those bearings put in place on the lift carriage. And this is a bit of a tricky deal here. They have to be located very accurately. So what I'm doing is I'm using the marking gauge that I made a few years ago. Probably for the first time, actually. I don't do a lot of work that requires this type of tool, but here I think it's perfect because what it'll do is it'll give me a very precise mark where I can line up the edge of my bearing. Next, I can install the thin strip bearings on the tilt carriage ends, and I've already marked out the location for this with pencil, and I'm going to use masking tape to temporarily hold it in place. Then I can take it and put it in place on the rest of the assembly so that I can position the other bearing. And then I can pull the tape off again and position the thicker bearing on top. And the holes in this bearing are slightly oversized so that I'll be able to adjust it as needed. Screwing on the front cover is next, and primarily what this does is it holds the tilt carriage ends in place around the lift assembly. And the last assembly step to get this part finished off is to install the lower slide support. So that completes the first sub-assembly of the table saw. And like I said at the beginning of the video, it is probably the most complex part. And also, like I said at the beginning of the video, special thanks goes out to my supporters on Patreon and channel members for helping to finance this project. Making project videos like this is time-consuming and expensive, so that support not only helps financially, it also encourages me to keep doing it and put out more projects like this.